550 KTRS. Ed Martin joins us, who is, I don't want to use the word insider because many people find that offensive, or you don't want to be called an insider. But Ed Martin, you have been on the inside of elections. You've been on all sides of this, and so and you don't have any axe to grind. You're not being paid by anybody, so you're our expert here. So it happened in 2014 in St. Louis County where they ran out of ballots. They all said this is never going to happen again, and it happened again now. The way you read the tea leaves, was this just incompetence? Was it nefarious, or was it both?
Well, and that's a great question, McGraw. As I was starting to warm up, I meant to set this up. I thought about it this morning early. When I got to the election board, I thought, oh my gosh, St. Louis City elections, it's going to be total fraud. And we found fraud. We found, Acorn, groups like Acorn were registering people that didn't exist, and there were people that were absentee balloting. One time we had a tower in North City that absentee balloted like 99%, and we ended up revoting it. So there is real fraud. But there's really two ways to sort of damage the integrity of elections. One is pure fraud, and there's some of that. The other is general incompetence that's allowed to keep going. And both are very effective, by the way, at committing fraud. So I would look at this and say it looks to me more like a pattern of incompetence, and which, by the way, should not be said, oh, well, at least they're not stealing it. Well, you can be incompetent in a way that steals it, right? That damages. And I used to tell my staff that there at the election board, we have two value statements. One is run really good elections, and two is give people the confidence that their votes count. Because right now around the country, there's not a lot of confidence in government effectively doing things. And if you don't believe your vote counts, you start to not show up, right? I mean, why bother if the game is rigged? So I think that there's a real problem. And look, I'm so tired of the idea that Jay Nixon says how bad this is, or even Stanger or whatever. St. Louis County's got a PR problem, a kind of, they ought to be all over these kinds of things they can control like this. And it's just embarrassing for St. Louis County, and they should be ashamed of themselves. I really think it. So
yesterday, I know some consultants went to the courts to try and keep the courts open, or the polls open. Even at one point, Steve Stanger was quoted as saying he wanted to keep the polls open until Wednesday if need be. There's no statute for that. There's no way to keep. There's no law that allows the ballots or the offices to stay open later, and so you start to wonder why are some people wanting to keep these open, and so on and so forth, right? So I mean, it's almost like everybody's dirty in the entire process.
And look, I don't want to segue right away. I mean, we'll have another show. We could talk about the rules of nominations, whether you're Hillary or Trump. And the fact is, you got to set the rules, the rule of law, the rules to abide by, and then you got to live within them. So when you say, well, let's keep the polls open for 15 more hours, that's not fair to everybody that put themselves in the game, whether it's on an issue or a name on the ballot, and said, show me the rules of the game. And then you don't get to move the basket from 10 feet to 12 feet and then claim it's fair. And the more you do that, the more people start to say, you know what, it's not a game that's played by rules. It's a game played by the refs. It's a game played by influencing the refs, and they start to not believe. So it's outrageous. I mean, the idea, and what would you do? Pass a statute that says anytime you're dumb enough to not have enough ballots, you're allowed to keep the polls open for 15 hours? I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
Right. Well, it's also discriminates over the people who vote early as opposed to the people who vote late.
Right. Exactly. I mean, there's nothing about it that is, again, it's shameful, and it's a disaster in terms of PR. Again, I just, as you said, the pattern is what makes you crazy. You say, come on, guys, don't get yourself the day after an election having to answer the same question you did 2 years ago.
Ed Martin, our guest. Ed, Mark Harder, St. Louis County Councilman, joins us on the phone. Mark Harder, thanks for joining us here on the Big 550 KTRS.
Hey, good to talk with you.
Do you have a question or a comment?
Well, I can't agree with Ed more on this. I mean, Ed's been around a long time and has seen it from the inside and out. A lot of the things he's talked about, are true from the standpoint of how the election board works. I will say, yesterday, my phone started ringing about 8 o'clock yesterday morning with constituents and others and candidates even saying, "Hey, we're out of ballots," and the polls are only open an hour. And I'm like, out of ballots? How could you be out of ballots? And then as we got into it, we could see that a lot of the polling places only had 15 ballots in a certain precinct, and maybe they had 100 or 200 over in this stack, and they reversed them in some cases from what we saw. In other words, the special elections should have had less or more, and it went the other way. We had a very contested election out in Chesterfield yesterday. All the wards, all the aldermen were contested, and and we had 3 precincts that ran out of ballots.
That's just unacceptable. I mean,
when
did we turn into Bangladesh that we cannot conduct a city council election?
Yeah. I mean, especially with a 10 or 12% turnout.
Yeah.
Is
Mark Harder,
is
let me
crazy.
let me ask you this question. You sit on the county council. You're a Republican. Whose
Yes.
fault is it? Is this Steve Stanger's fault? Is this Governor Nixon's fault? Is it some bureaucrat who's just not smart enough? Because many of these are some are elected, some are patronage jobs. So
Yes.
where does the blame literally fall on this?
I think it was a perfect storm of blame. I think there's a lot of people at a lot of different levels, starting from the governor on down. The governor appoints the election board, and the election board, no one knows who these people are. I mean, yes, they're on a website somewhere, but no one sees these people. They need to be held accountable. The 2 directors, both Republican and Democrat, on the county election board need to be held accountable. I called last night at our county council meeting for an investigation in what we call as a committee of the whole, and that was approved by the council, but it's up to the chairman, Michael Mara, to schedule that hearing. So hopefully we can get that done here in the next week, so we can get to the bottom of what went wrong and who's to blame, and how are we going to avoid this in the future? Because so many people, like you said, are disenfranchised. They think the system's rigged. They say voting sometimes could be a problem anyway, and now you're just making it that much more problematic.
Mark Harder, hold on the line. Ed, I want to ask you a question, but do you want to comment on?
Yeah,
on
look,
anything
let
Mark
me
said?
say it. Mark is important because Mark's doing a great job of serving, but I'm not in service. Look, the way it works is when you're on one of these boards, like St. Louis County, the Democrats are the lead because the Democrat's governor. That's who appoints them. So, Jay Nixon, if he cares, he ought to ask the members of that board of elections to resign. They should resign today. They should be embarrassed, all 4 of them. He should. If the governor, I can tell you, I was chief of staff. If the governor calls up and says, or his chief of staff does, I want you 4 to resign, they'll resign. And they should put in 4 people that will actually do the job. The second thing is the Democrat director is the guy who's in charge, and the second Republican director is the guy who's sort of the deputy. That's the way it works when you have a Democrat. This is the reality. And that guy should be fired. If he can't be fired, he ought to be reprimanded. He ought to be put. I mean, the public is sick of everybody. Steve Stanger's now going to have a committee, and maybe the chairman will call a committee of the whole, and we'll have something. That's all fine. But we need the buck to stop somewhere, and somebody needs to be held accountable. And I would just say Steve Stanger, right now, Steve Stanger's record of healing the wounds that have St. Louis County as a laughingstock in the country too often it's pretty bad. And so if I was him, I would be not saying, oh, geez, this is really bad. I'd be saying, whose head's on the block? And let's swing that the chop, and let's move on. I just think that the people are sick of it. I mean, it can't. How long are you going to wait? We're going to have another election. By the way, the next election is going to be Roy Blunt versus Jason Kander. This guy, by the way, the Secretary of State, where's he? I can tell you when you're the chairman of the Board of Elections in the city, the guy who you have to deal with the most is the Secretary of State. So where's Kander? What's his answer on why we don't have ballots? Again, somebody's got to be held accountable.
I want to ask you both a very important question. Mark Harder, can you hold on to the break?
Sure.
Ed, can you hold on to the break?
Always, McGraw. I just spend my time with you. It's great.
All right, hang tight. Ed Martin works at the Eagle Forum in Phyllis Schlafly now. Mark Harder is a St. Louis County councilman. Both of them will be back in a moment. It's 9:35 here, Big 550 KTRS. Let's all go to Ted Drewes, right? We can all vote at Ted Drewes. They got plenty of Ted Drewes.